So context is always important because with enough points made, authors can shift our beliefs. You start with like one view first before reading the entirety of like a essay, whatever. And by the end of it, your belief on that subject or topic may have changed because of all that context given to you, right? And so with this, it's called a feature story. With this feature story given by Gay Talese on Frank Sinatra, you start to kind of like get a better idea of who the man is, not from the segment I've given you necessarily, but in the entire piece itself, it shifts the view from like this sort of happy, smiley celebrity who is very influential and all that into somebody who's a little darker and controversial in nature, right? So before we dive into the student sample that I want to work with here, I want to give you some context on Sinatra, just because I think it's interesting, and you can skip this if you like to, but just like me nerding out on some factors and all that, right? The first time you might have even heard of a Sinatra song was from Squid Game, actually, the recent Netflix series that was very, very popular and all that. But there's a scene where the I forgot what his name was, the person who's like kind of in charge of the game, and the manager, I think it's called the manager. He's like sitting in a little lair and he's listening to "Fly Me to the Moon" by Sinatra here, while like this very extravagant like puppet set, I guess, is singing there. And there is a reason why they chose that, by the way, and it kind of ties in with this lecture here too, is because underneath the sort of like, I guess, niceness of everything, there is like this darker organization hidden beneath the image of it there. So Sinatra is actually known to be tied with like the mafia, with kind of like the underworld altogether. So on the underneath of the surface here, there is this darker world that presides, right? Which is the Squid Game itself. So little fun fact for you if you were curious there. But anywho, Sinatra, who is he? He's one of the most influential people of the 20th century. He is actually a lot bigger than just music, as you saw from the reading there. Even those 7 paragraphs kind of gives you an idea of how influential and also how impactful he was altogether. How big was he? Well, hold on, a little grammar issue here. He was pretty big in the sense that, number one, back in the old days, in the early 1900s, there wasn't pop music yet. Actually, if you were listening to pop music, like what was happening at the time, you were considered a hipster. That's actually where the term comes from, a hipster, a person who's hip, a person who's kind of like following the current trends. And that was kind of like actually frowned upon until Sinatra came into being here. Actually, when he started making his music, people were like, hey, popular music can't be good and can't be influential and can't be like, the thing of the times. Because back then, you listened to old music, you listened to things that you would have like reminiscing of nostalgia over and all that. But he kind of dictates the beginning of popular music. Anyone who wrote lyrics for him became established songwriters, because if you can write for Sinatra, you can write for anybody, really. He was adored by all. He was considered one of the earliest, if not the first, pop idols in America. So kind of like the first like pretty boy who everyone wanted to idol over and all that. Considering inflation, he is the first billionaire musician. So this guy was like rich. He was super powerful in that regard there. And he even started movies, owned businesses, employed hundreds of people under him. Like, this guy is not, again, just a singer. He's Sinatra. So there's an old saying, women wanted him and men wanted to be him, which is true. That was kind of like how popular he was. He was just kind of like untouchable in that sort of star status there. But there's sort of this darker undertone to him. If you want to rethink Sinatra, here's a little bit of a snippet of a person who was like, observing him in the recording room. So it says, Frank Sinatra show, Act 1, page 10, take 1, called a man with a clapboard, jumping in front of the camera, clap, then jumping away again. And Sinatra says, did you ever stop to think, Sinatra began, what the world would be like without a song? It would be a pretty dreary place. Gives you something to think about, doesn't it? Sinatra stopped. Excuse me, he said, adding, boy, I need a drink. And that's probably where the story starts, with the bar and everything. No, it's not related, but that's the thing about Sinatra. He has this sort of more existential side to him, this sort of like more depressed and gloomy side to him here. And he has a very sketchy past. Not everything of him is like molded in perfection, right? So as a kid, he was actually stuck in his mother's womb and had to pull him out with forceps. And as they pulled him out, they presumed him dead, until his grandmother put running cold water on him, and he came back to life, essentially there. So even in the beginning, kind of like a sort of fight with life or death, which makes one existential in the first place. And because of those forceps, he has this little scar on the side of his face. We saw this picture over here. He has these little, like, I guess not bruises, but like these like indents, right? And so it leaves like this lifetime scar for him to remember. He was always a bad boy character. He was arrested early for adultery, so which is cheating on his wife, and whoever he was with, really. And his fame It was kind of synthetic and artificial at first. Basically, what he would do is he would pay people to like cheer at his concerts. So when he was kind of like a smaller name or like a nobody, he basically like give people $5, like, hey, go and cheer at my concert, and then he would cheer him, hype him up, and everyone's like, "Oh, is this Sinatra guy good? Maybe he is." And so his rise to fame becomes like that. There, connection to the mob. This guy basically was doing some sketchy stuff behind the scenes here. He was investigated for paying $40,000 to declare him unfit to serve in the armed services. He doesn't want to go to war, so he's dodging the draft and all that. Found connections to him with mafia, found connections to shady businesses, drug dealers, lobby politicians, and all that. Like, this guy wasn't just doing music, he was doing a lot more and a lot of bad things altogether. And he was kind of shaky emotionally, too. Example here, in the 50s, basically, he felt like his fame was like falling, right? And so he's walking around and he sees these girls like cheering over this new guy, Eddie Fisher. There's like this new celebrity here. And he feels washed up. So he goes to his apartment later. He puts his head on the stove and he turns on the gas and he's trying to like basically, end his life, right? His manager finds him and he's like lying on the floor sobbing. And Sinatra's like, just like in dread of how he's losing some fame and all that there. And he's had like issues with like actresses, with other celebrities and all that, and just various girlfriends, and each one was volatile. It's like up and down, full of issues. So this guy, he's not very steady. He's not very secure. He's kind of a broken soul altogether here. And with all that in mind, you start to think to yourself like, oh, maybe Sinatra's not that great of a person. He's kind of shattered, right? It's context. Context is super important because as you start getting more context, it changes the story and you get the whole story then, right? So the whole thing about any author's piece is you can't just look at a single paragraph too. That paragraph exists in the entirety of it. And so everything is related to each other. Everything bounces off each other, which is why transitions are important. So let me transition real quick to the student work that I want to analyze for today here. Where is it? Give me a second here. Aha, transitions. Shazam. And I wanted to look at this student sample here because I thought it was a pretty good job altogether. Let me just drag it a little bit over so you can see it. And I think my ugly face is in cover, so I think we're good here. And I just want to read through and see what the student did altogether, right? So this is from the Kevin Young. I censored the other one's name because, I don't know actually, you know what? Maybe I just have a grudge against Kevin Young. So sorry, Kevin. It's because we share the same name. And so I'm trying to like, mess with you, I guess. But let's see what Kevin wrote and why it's a pretty good job in terms of understanding Gay Talese's work here. Frank Sinatra has a cold. So from paragraph 2 to 3, Kevin writes, the second paragraph explains the reasoning behind Frank Sinatra's emotions, giving details to Sinatra's situation in life and ending off by touching on his sickness from a cold. Paragraph 3 follows up by explaining how the cold can affect Sinatra, revealing the illness has a much bigger impact than at first glance. So there's a lot of key words in transitions here, right? Where the paragraph deals with this cold and his emotions, and it kind of blends together to kind of shows cause and effect, where it's kind of like, oh, he has a cold and he's sad. Okay, what does a cold mean? A cold means all these other things that are related to Sinatra as a whole. So in paragraph number 3 to 4, the paragraph ends off with a comparison between Sinatra and the President of the United States in an attempt to show Sinatra's impact on America. This sets paragraph 4 up to explain how wide Sinatra's influence is across many different people, occupations, and times. And that's kind of like a trigger word, right? Or kind of the trigger comparison. The author, compares Sinatra to the President of the United States. And you might be thinking like, that's kind of a hyperbole until you get to the actual paragraph and you're like, whoa, actually, he's actually quite big as a name and a person and influence. So it starts to like prove that statement previously. It's almost like thesis in a way, how Talese kind of combines everything all together here. In 4 to 5, paragraph 4 acts as a positive paragraph that ends on a happy note on how Sinatra is able to positively influence the people that view him and his works in order to bring the reader back to Sinatra's current situation. The 5th paragraph briefly returns to Sinatra quietly drinking at the bar in Beverly Hills, back to reality for a bit. Yes, it's almost like film, you know what I mean? First, it shows Sinatra, he's at the bar, he's sad, he has a cold, and then you're like, oh, okay, what's up with that? And it goes into like a flashback of all the things he's done, and you're like, damn, okay, he's actually a really big name. And it it brings us back to the bar scene, and then you see Sinatra, and now you have more context, and now you're like, oh, I see why he might be extra sad, because, there's a lot on his shoulders here. 5 to 6. As paragraph 5 quickly returns to Sinatra's situation in the bar, it reminds readers of the original hardships and cold that he is facing. After the quick reminder, paragraph 6 is free to bounce back into the world of praise as it dives into how Sinatra's lyrics are able to provide deep meaning for the world. So it's kind of like glorification once more, right? You see this small little man who's like, going through a cold, but it's not just a sad little man. Packed in him is a person who's also delivered music that's changed lives and so forth. So it goes from like this big and small effect here of seeing who Sinatra is. And the very end of this here, the sixth paragraph brings up the topic of relationships and love and how Sinatra's music has played into it. The following paragraph then transitions from this by bringing up and describing the two blonde girls at the bar. While not directly related to love, the description of the girls follows the theme of romance that was brought up in the sixth paragraph. Smart. I like what Kevin's seeing here. He notices that in the paragraph before, paragraph 6, it deals with this idea of romance and all that and how his music was impactful towards it. And then later in paragraph 7, even though it's not directly his romance, it kind of brings us back to like men, woman, the relationship between the two and all that, focuses on the blondes that we saw in the very first paragraph here. Do you see how nothing is kind of like wasted? Everything kind of goes back to each other and has its reverberations from one point to another, right? So Talise does a really good job making sure everything is connected to it. And in these 7 paragraphs, it's related. The people in the bar, Sinatra's cold, how big he is, his impacts, his lyrics, and all that. It's cram-packed in these 7 paragraphs, and we never lose track of what we're actually reading here. And that's why Frank Sinatra's Has a Cold is considered one of the great feature stories of the time period, just because Talise does such a good job. And Kevin does a really good job here analyzing this piece. So good on you, and good understanding transitions.